Let's start at the top, where the real control center for fat loss exists, the brain, specifically the hypothalamus. This tiny structure located deep in the brain plays an outsized role in determining your body weight, hunger levels, energy expenditure, and even how much fat your body is willing to burn or store. It integrates signals from your body, like hormones, nutrients, and even temperature, and decides how your metabolism should respond. Here's how it works. The hypothalamus receives input from hormones like leptin, insulin, and ghrelin. Leptin comes from fat cells and tells the brain, essentially, we have enough stored energy. Insulin released from the pancreas gives a signal about carbohydrate availability and overall energy balance. Ghrelin, which is produced in the stomach, tells the brain when you're hungry. These hormones bind to specific receptors in the hypothalamus and activate or suppress certain neural circuits. The result, you either feel the drive to eat more or the signal to stop eating gets turned on. This is not a vague general awareness of hunger or fullness. These are highly specific molecular level communications that influence your behavior through changes in brain chemistry and firing patterns. For example, when leptin levels are high, neurons in the arcuate nucleus of the hypothalamus activate satiety pathways and suppress hunger. But when leptin levels drop, like during a calorie deficit, those same neurons flip, increasing appetite and reducing energy expenditure. That's right. The brain can downshift your metabolism to preserve energy. So if you're dieting hard and ignoring sleep, your brain may interpret that as a threat to survival and trigger a biological response to conserve fat, not lose it. This is often misinterpreted as plateauing, but really, it's the brain adapting to perceived energy scarcity. The hypothalamus doesn't act alone. It communicates with other brain regions, like the brainstem, which controls automatic behaviors, and the limbic system, which governs emotional responses, to create a unified strategy for managing energy. That includes triggering cravings, shifting your mood, and even altering your willingness to exercise. If your brain decides conserving energy is a priority, it will reduce your motivation to move. This isn't laziness, it's neurobiology. The neuroendocrine system, which connects the brain to the hormone-producing glands in the body, also plays a central role. When the hypothalamus signals the pituitary gland, it can trigger cascades of hormones like cortisol from the adrenal glands or thyroid hormones that affect your metabolic rate. So if you're chronically stressed, for example, the brain can alter cortisol output in a way that promotes fat storage, especially around the abdomen, regardless of your calorie intake. All this points to one truth. Fat loss is not just about eating less and moving more. It's about how your brain interprets those actions. The brain is constantly assessing whether you're in a state of safety and abundance or threat and scarcity. That interpretation drives everything from hunger signals to metabolic shifts. When you align your behaviors in a way that convinces the brain you're in control and not at risk, fat loss becomes biologically supported, not resisted. To understand fat loss, we need to talk about dopamine, not just as a feel-good molecule, but as a key player in what actually drives your eating behavior before you ever take a bite. Most people think dopamine is about pleasure, but that's a misunderstanding. Dopamine is fundamentally about motivation and anticipation. It's what gets you to act. It's the chemical that says, go get that. When it comes to food, dopamine doesn't spike when you eat, it spikes before you eat. It rises when you see a cue, a signal, or a trigger associated with food. The crinkle of a bag, the smell of something fried, or even just the memory of a favorite snack. That dopamine release energizes the brain and body to pursue the reward. This is known as incentive salience. The brain assigns importance to a stimulus, and dopamine mobilizes you toward it. This has profound implications for fat loss, because many of our eating habits are not driven by physical hunger. They're driven by these dopaminergic patterns, circuits that have been reinforced over time through repetition and emotional conditioning. Every time you reach for food when stressed, bored, or celebrating, you strengthen that circuit. The brain learns that food is the path to reward, regardless of energy needs. There are specific areas in the brain that govern this process: the ventral tegmental area, VTA, and the nucleus accumbens, to name two. These regions interact in a loop that prioritizes behaviors associated with previous reward. And here's the catch: the more often you repeat that loop, the less rewarding the food has to be. The anticipation alone becomes enough to drive the craving. This is why people often say, "I wasn't even that hungry, but I couldn't stop thinking about it." That's not weakness, it's dopamine at work. Importantly, this system is plastic. It can adapt. That means the circuits can be rewired, but it takes deliberate effort. You have to start by becoming aware of the triggers. What are the cues that prompt the craving? Is it a time of day, a place, an emotional state? Once identified, those triggers can be intercepted with a new behavior. That's how you begin to shift the dopamine response toward healthier choices. Another powerful approach is reward prediction error. This means introducing a change that breaks the expected reward. For instance, if you usually eat while watching TV, but you change the context, like eating in silence or journaling after, you create a disruption in the dopamine loop. Over time, the craving weakens because the brain no longer gets the same chemical payoff. The key insight is this: dopamine doesn't care about calories. It cares about what you've taught it to expect. So fat loss isn't just about avoiding certain foods, it's about retraining your brain to expect reward from the right sources. When you can direct dopamine toward exercise, nourishing food, or post-meal clarity, the brain starts to align with your fat loss goals. You're not fighting cravings, you're replacing them. If fat loss is going to be sustainable, it has to involve more than just willpower. It requires a rewiring of the brain, specifically the neural circuits that drive when, how, and why you eat or move. These circuits are built through repetition. That means every time you engage in a behavior, whether it's late night snacking, skipping a workout, or reaching for sugar when stressed, you're strengthening a pattern in the brain. Over time, that pattern becomes automatic. It moves from conscious choice to subconscious habit. These patterns are built in a few specific regions of the brain: the basal ganglia, which plays a central role in habit formation, the prefrontal cortex, which handles executive decision-making, and the limbic system, which attaches emotional value to behaviors. When these areas work together repeatedly around the same action, the behavior becomes ingrained. This is why certain food habits feel so hard to break. They become neurologically efficient. But here's the good news: what's wired can be unwired. Neuroplasticity means these circuits are malleable. They can be changed through targeted behavioral interventions. That doesn't mean random willpower. It means deliberate, repeated actions that create new neural associations and weaken old ones. For example, let's say you always snack in the evening while watching television. That behavior isn't just about the food. It's the entire context: the time of day, the environment, the screen, the emotional state. All of those are part of a reinforced circuit. If you want to change it, you have to replace, not just remove, the behavior. You might introduce a new routine at that same time. Take a walk, drink tea, journal, or stretch. If done consistently, the brain begins to associate that time and setting with a different reward. This is how the brain learns, through action followed by outcome. If the new behavior leads to a positive emotional or physiological state, like calmness, clarity, or energy, the brain starts to prefer that loop. Over time, the dopamine system shifts its expectations. That's how new habits are built, by providing a better reward, not just suppressing the old one. Exercise is similar. Many people struggle with consistency because the brain hasn't yet attached a strong reward to the activity. Early on, working out can feel like effort without payoff. But if you pay attention to the after effects, improved mood, reduced anxiety, enhanced focus, you can consciously amplify those feelings and start building a new neural association. That's what reinforces the behavior. Also important is the concept of friction. When building new patterns, reduce the number of steps between you and the behavior. Lay out your clothes in advance, choose a workout you enjoy, prepare meals ahead. Every bit of friction removed increases the likelihood that the new pattern will fire and be reinforced. Neural change doesn't happen all at once. It requires consistency and repetition, but the brain is designed to adapt. If you train it through targeted, emotionally rewarding behaviors, the patterns that once held you back can become the very ones that move you forward. Fat loss then becomes less about battling old habits and more about building new, automatic ones. When we talk about fat loss, sleep is often overlooked. People focus on diet, training, supplements, but the truth is, sleep is one of the most powerful regulators of fat-burning behavior and physiology. Not getting enough sleep doesn't just make you tired. It changes your brain chemistry, shifts your hormone levels, and directly impairs your ability to make decisions around food and movement. Let's start with the hormonal cascade. Just one night of restricted sleep, let's say less than 6 hours, leads to a measurable increase in ghrelin, the hormone that stimulates appetite. At the same time, levels of leptin, the hormone that signals satiety, go down. So your brain gets two messages: eat more and you're still hungry. This isn't psychological, it's biochemical. The body is tricked into thinking it needs more energy than it really does. But the story goes deeper. Lack of sleep also impacts insulin sensitivity. In a sleep-deprived state, your body becomes less efficient at processing glucose, leading to higher blood sugar levels and greater fat storage, especially in visceral areas. Even more concerning, these changes can happen after just a few nights of poor sleep. This isn't chronic sleep deprivation, it's the common 5 to 6 hour nights many people experience during a busy week. Now let's look at what happens in the brain. Sleep loss alters activity in the prefrontal cortex, which is the area responsible for impulse control, long-term planning, and rational decision-making. At the same time, the amygdala, which processes emotional stimuli, becomes hyperactive. That shift creates a dangerous combination. Your brain becomes more reactive to food cues, especially high-calorie, high-reward options, and less capable of making disciplined choices. In practical terms, this means when you're tired, you're not just craving more food, you're craving worse food. You're more likely to reach for processed carbohydrates, sugar, and fast food, and you're less likely to stop once you start. That's not because you're weak. It's because the neural machinery for self-regulation is offline. There's also an impact on movement. Sleep deprivation decreases activation in the striatum, a brain region involved in initiating physical activity. So not only are you more hungry, but you're less likely to want to move. Your motivation drops, and the likelihood of skipping your workout goes up, not from laziness, but because the brain isn't producing the neurochemical environment needed for drive and action. Even your muscle recovery and fat oxidation suffer when sleep is compromised. Growth hormone, which plays a key role in fat metabolism and lean muscle preservation, is released during deep sleep. Without enough of that high-quality sleep, your body loses a critical window for recovery and metabolic optimization. So if you're serious about fat loss, sleep has to be non-negotiable. It's not a passive state, It's an active, regulated process that shapes how your brain and body perform the next day. If sleep is dialed in, hunger signals stabilize, decision-making improves, and your behavior starts to align with your goals. In short, sleep sets the stage for everything else to work. To truly understand fat loss, you have to understand stress, not just as a psychological experience, but as a neurochemical event that changes how your brain and body operate. Chronic stress doesn't just make you feel overwhelmed, it shifts the brain into a mode where it prioritizes immediate comfort and safety. And one of the fastest, most accessible ways the brain has learned to generate that sense of safety is through food. Specifically high-calorie, high-reward foods. Here's what happens. When you're under stress, the brain activates the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis, the HPA axis. This triggers the release of cortisol from the adrenal glands. Cortisol is a survival hormone. In acute doses, it's adaptive. It helps mobilize energy, increase focus, and heighten awareness. But when stress becomes chronic, when your cortisol levels remain elevated for long periods, this system begins to dysregulate. And that's where the trouble begins for fat loss. Cortisol interacts directly with the brain's reward systems, especially the dopamine and opioid pathways. It essentially amplifies your brain's sensitivity to rewards. So when you're stressed, that bag of chips or that slice of pizza doesn't just taste good, it feels necessary. The brain is trying to calm itself, to find relief from a state of physiological discomfort. And high-calorie foods, which rapidly activate dopamine and trigger opioid-like responses in the brain, become the most efficient tool for that. This is not about willpower. This is neurobiology. The brain is constantly scanning for ways to soothe itself. And if it has learned that certain foods reduce feelings of anxiety, uncertainty, or overwhelm, even temporarily, it will continue to drive behavior in that direction. These patterns can become hardwired, creating what are essentially stress-eating loops. You feel tension, you eat, the tension drops slightly, and the brain marks that as a successful strategy. Reinforce. What's even more interesting is that these reward responses can become decoupled from actual hunger. In other words, you can crave food purely because the brain has learned to associate eating with emotional relief. This is where the insula and anterior cingulate cortex come into play, areas of the brain involved in emotional processing and interoception. They help translate emotional states into physical urges. That's why stress doesn't just feel emotional, it becomes visceral. It creates a physical need to act. So to lose fat sustainably, stress cannot be ignored. You have to give the brain other healthier tools for managing its internal state. Practices like deep nasal breathing, cold exposure, walking outdoors, or even structured journaling can activate parasympathetic pathways and reduce cortisol. When you reduce the internal pressure, you reduce the need for external relief. The goal isn't to eliminate stress. That's impossible. The goal is to change how your brain and body respond to it. When the brain is no longer in a constant state of seeking comfort through food, you regain control over your behaviors. Fat loss becomes less about battling cravings and more about creating a neurochemical environment that makes healthy choices feel natural, not forced. If you want to create lasting fat loss, you have to stop thinking purely in terms of discipline and start thinking in terms of neural loops. Every behavior, especially repeated ones like eating certain foods or avoiding exercise, is governed by circuits in the brain. These circuits operate on a loop. Cue, behavior, reward. Over time, this loop becomes automatic. And most people are stuck in loops that don't serve their goals, but still serve their brain's desire for quick reward. Let's break that down. A cue can be anything. Stress, boredom, time of day, even a social situation. That cue triggers a behavior like opening the fridge or reaching for your phone to order food. The reward follows. Dopamine is released, creating a sense of satisfaction, relief, or even just distraction. That dopamine doesn't just make you feel good, it teaches the brain, this was a good response to that cue, do it again next time. That's how a loop is formed. Now, these loops aren't inherently bad, they're efficient. Your brain loves efficiency, but when the reward is tied to unhealthy behaviors, high sugar foods, late night snacking, skipping physical activity, the loop reinforces a state that resists fat loss. The key is not just to break the loop, but to replace it. You have to give the brain a new source of reward, one that aligns with your goals. This is where behavioral neuroplasticity comes in. You can deliberately create new circuits by introducing a different behavior in response to the same cue and then rewarding it in a way that the brain finds meaningful. For example, instead of snacking when you feel stressed, you go for a brisk walk and then listen to a piece of music you enjoy or do something creative that you find engaging. At first it feels forced, but over time, as you repeat the new loop and associate it with a dopamine-producing experience, the brain begins to prefer it. One of the most powerful things you can do is start linking dopamine to process rather than outcome. Most people only feel good when they see the number on the scale drop. That's a delayed reward. The brain isn't wired to wait. But if you can train yourself to feel good about the act of showing up to train, choosing nutrient-dense food, or feeling the clarity that comes after hydration or movement, now you're giving the brain what it craves in the moment. That's when the loop starts to change. You can also enhance the rewiring by creating friction around the old loop. Make the undesirable behavior less accessible. Hide the snacks. Uninstall the food delivery app. Change your environment. At the same time, reduce friction around the new habit. Lay out your gym clothes. Pre-prep your meals. Simplify the decision-making process. The easier it is to repeat a behavior, the faster the new circuit forms. Fat loss happens when the brain starts rewarding the right behaviors. When you disrupt the old loops and establish new ones linked to genuine, sustainable reward, the shift isn't just physical, it's neurological. That's when fat loss stops being a fight and becomes your brain's default direction. If we're talking about fat loss as a brain-driven process, then we have to consider two of the most underutilized natural interventions available: physical activity and sunlight exposure. These are not just healthy lifestyle tips. They are powerful regulators of brain chemistry and hormonal function that directly influence appetite control, energy metabolism, and mood. And when they're used strategically, they shift your biology into a state that supports fat loss instead of resisting it. But let's start with physical activity. Movement, especially early in the day, has an immediate impact on the brain. It increases dopamine, norepinephrine, and serotonin levels, all of which elevate alertness, mood, and motivation. But it also plays a direct role in appetite regulation. During and after exercise, levels of certain hormones like peptide Y, these hormones are released from the gut and send satiety signals to the brain, particularly to areas in the hypothalamus that regulate feeding behavior. In parallel, ghrelin, the hunger hormone, tends to decrease after moderate to intense physical activity. That's not just a coincidence. It's a neurochemical shift that reduces food-seeking drive. This means exercise isn't just burning calories, it's altering the signals that govern how much food you want to eat later. That's a massive shift in how we should view physical activity in the context of fat loss. You're not just using energy, you're recalibrating the neural thermostat that controls hunger and satiety. Now let's bring in sunlight exposure, particularly in the early part of the day when sunlight hits the retina. It activates specialized cells that send signals directly to the suprachiasmatic nucleus, the brain's master clock. This sets off a cascade of hormonal and neurochemical events that regulate your circadian rhythm, cortisol release, and even melatonin timing later in the evening. But there's more. Early sunlight also boosts dopamine production in the brain, especially in the striatum and prefrontal cortex, areas involved in motivation and decision-making. Dopamine isn't just about reward. It also helps regulate impulse control. When dopamine levels are optimized early in the day through light exposure and movement, people are more likely to make aligned, rational decisions around food. You feel more capable of sticking to a plan, more motivated to move, and less pulled by cravings or emotional eating triggers. Sunlight also impacts leptin sensitivity. Leptin, the hormone that signals fullness, doesn't just depend on how much body fat you have. It depends on how well your brain listens to the leptin signal. Regular circadian alignment through natural light helps restore that sensitivity, so your brain becomes more accurate in interpreting fullness and energy status. So you have two completely accessible tools, movement and sunlight, that modulate neurotransmitters and hormones to shift your internal state toward satiety, metabolic flexibility, and behavioral control. These aren't abstract ideas. They're immediate, measurable changes in your neurobiology that, when used consistently, help turn fat loss from a struggle into something that your body and brain begin to support automatically. If you're serious about fat loss, you need to understand how state control, especially through breath work, can directly influence the brain systems that govern eating behavior. Most people try to manage their food intake by focusing on macros, meal timing, or cutting out certain foods, but they completely ignore the underlying state their brain is in when those decisions are being made. And that's a critical mistake, because your mental and physiological state determines your behavioral output. When you're in a stressed, anxious, or fatigued state, the brain shifts into survival mode. The prefrontal cortex, the region responsible for impulse control and long-term decision-making, goes offline, or at the very least becomes less active. Simultaneously, deeper structures like the amygdala and insular cortex become more active, which heightens emotional reactivity and drives impulsive behaviors. In that state, the brain is wired to seek immediate comfort, often through food. So the key becomes learning how to change state on demand, and one of the fastest and most effective tools for that is breath work. This isn't about meditation or spirituality. It's about controlling the autonomic nervous system through specific patterns of breathing that shift your physiology within minutes. For example, double inhales through the nose, followed by a long, slow exhale through the mouth, a pattern known to activate the parasympathetic nervous system, can downregulate stress responses in the brain almost immediately. It lowers heart rate, decreases cortisol levels, and reactivates the prefrontal cortex. This means your decision-making improves, cravings diminish, and your ability to delay gratification goes up. All of that directly supports fat loss. What's even more compelling is that these breathing protocols aren't just reactive, they're also proactive. Practicing state shifts daily, even for just 3 to 5 minutes, trains the nervous system to become more resilient. It builds what's called autonomic flexibility, your brain and body's ability to move quickly from a reactive state to a calm, controlled one. And that gives you more leverage when facing real-world challenges like emotional eating, social food pressure, or fatigue-based cravings. Breathwork also taps into interoception, the brain's ability to sense the internal state of the body. When you regularly practice breathing with intention, the insular cortex becomes more finely tuned. That matters because it's the same brain region that tracks hunger, fullness, and energy levels. The more connected you are to those signals, the more accurately you can regulate eating behavior, not based on emotion, but on what your body actually needs. Incorporating deliberate state change practices before meals, during high-stress moments, or as part of a morning or evening routine can fundamentally shift your relationship with food. You're not just reacting, you're regulating. And the more often you do it, the more it becomes your new baseline. Fat loss isn't just about what you eat. It's about when you eat, why you eat, and who you are neurologically in those moments. If you can shift your state, you can change your behavior. And if you can change your behavior consistently, fat loss becomes a natural byproduct, not a constant battle. When it comes to fat loss, one of the most misunderstood dynamics is how the brain interprets food, not just in terms of calories, but in terms of reward. People often assume that junk food is irresistible simply because it tastes good. But in reality, the brain's reward system is shaped by repeated exposure and learned association. This means that even highly processed, hyperpalatable foods aren't inherently more rewarding. They're just more familiar to the brain's reward circuits, and that's something you can change. The dopamine system, the same system that drives motivation, goal-seeking, and reinforcement learning, is heavily involved in how we respond to food. The first few times you eat a salty snack, a sugary dessert, or a processed carb, you get a large dopamine response. But more importantly, your brain starts to anticipate that response. That anticipation creates a feedback loop. You see the food, dopamine is released before you even take a bite, and the craving is reinforced. What many people don't realize is that this loop can be retrained. The brain is plastic. It adapts based on repetition and reward prediction. When you start consistently eating nutrient-dense foods, foods rich in fiber, micronutrients, high-quality fats, and protein, you can begin to associate those foods with positive post-meal outcomes, sustained energy, improved focus, reduced cravings, better digestion. These are subtle but powerful signals to the brain that the food you just consumed was valuable. Over time, if you pay attention to those signals and consciously link them to your food choices, the reward circuitry starts to shift. Dopamine release becomes associated with the preparation and consumption of those healthier options. You begin to feel satisfaction from a bowl of roasted vegetables with avocado and olive oil, not because it's flashy or engineered to hijack your palate, but because your brain starts to recognize that this food actually makes you feel better for longer. There's also a physiological side to this. Nutrient-dense foods tend to stabilize blood sugar, which reduces swings in mood and energy that drive impulsive eating. They also support the gut microbiome, which produces metabolites that feed back to the brain through the vagus nerve and influence everything from mood to appetite regulation. In short, eating nutrient-dense foods doesn't just change your body composition, it rewires your brain chemistry in real time. But the key is repetition and attention. If you eat a healthy meal, while thinking of it as punishment or restriction, the brain won't register as rewarding. But if you eat the same meal while tuned into how it affects your body, how it improves clarity, mood, and satiety, you start creating new reward associations. And those associations stick. Fat loss becomes sustainable when healthy choices stop feeling like sacrifice and start feeling like satisfaction. The way to get there isn't through willpower, it's through consistent exposure to nutrient-rich foods and conscious reinforcement of how they make you feel. That's how you train the brain to crave what actually supports your goals. When we talk about fat loss, many people view it as a battle against their body or willpower, something that's inherently difficult and requires extreme effort. But the truth is, fat loss is not just a matter of calorie restriction or intense workouts. It's about neuroplasticity, the brain's ability to adapt, change, and learn new patterns. This means fat loss is not only possible, it's trainable, adaptable, and when approached from a neurological standpoint, completely sustainable. At the core of this is the brain's ability to rewire itself based on the behaviors you repeat. This process is called neuroplasticity. Whether you're learning to play an instrument, forming a new habit, or changing your eating patterns, your brain is constantly reorganizing itself, and that includes how it responds to food, hunger, satiety, and physical activity. The first step in making fat loss sustainable is understanding that you're not just trying to control your body, you're training your brain. Your neural circuits govern every behavior, including your eating habits. If you've been used to eating processed foods or overeating in response to stress, that behavior has created specific pathways in your brain. These circuits are reinforced over time, which makes them feel automatic and hard to break. But the beauty of neuroplasticity is that these circuits are not set in stone. They can be rewired. For instance, when you begin to eat nutrient-dense foods regularly, your brain starts to create new reward associations. Initially, it might feel like a challenge or even unpleasant, especially if you're accustomed to the high-calorie, sugar-laden foods that light up the brain's reward centers. But over time, as you continue to make healthier choices and consistently associate them with feeling better, more energy, improved mood, and reduced cravings, the brain starts to change. It begins to associate those foods with positive rewards, shifting your cravings toward healthier options. Similarly, if you engage in physical activity consistently, your brain's reward system adapts. Exercise doesn't just burn calories, it releases a cocktail of neurotransmitters like dopamine, serotonin, and endorphins that reinforce positive feelings and reduce stress. Initially, it might feel like a chore, but as you repeat the behavior and your brain starts to recognize the benefits, both physical and psychological, the neural pathways related to exercise strengthen, making you more likely to choose movement over inactivity in the future. What's also important to understand is that the brain is highly adaptable based on the environment you create for it. If you surround yourself with cues that promote healthy habits, like prepping meals in advance, having workout gear visible, or reducing access to tempting junk food, you're essentially creating an environment that encourages the brain to follow the pathways you want to reinforce. The more you set up your surroundings to support your goals, the more your brain will be trained to gravitate toward these behaviors automatically. Fat loss, when approached neurologically, becomes less about brute force and more about consistent, strategic changes in the brain's reward and decision-making processes. It's not a quick fix. It's a rewiring of the system that supports long-term health and sustainability. The more you repeat healthy behaviors, the more your brain will adapt, making these behaviors feel increasingly natural and less like a struggle. And that's how fat loss becomes not just possible, but inevitable. In conclusion, fat loss isn't just about cutting calories or pushing through intense workouts. It's about understanding how your brain controls your behavior and how you can use the principles of neuroplasticity to your advantage. By training your brain to form new habits, build healthier reward systems, and respond differently to stress, you can make fat loss a natural, sustainable process. Every small change you make today lays the foundation for a healthier future. When you focus on rewiring your brain's patterns through conscious choices, consistency, and understanding of your body's needs, fat loss becomes a journey of adaptation, not deprivation. With time, patience, and the right strategies, your brain and body can work together to support the long-term health and well-being you deserve.